Somewhere on a shelf right now there is a cooler with a price tag of $350. And sitting right beside it, in a plainer box, is a cooler that will hold your ice nearly as long, for under $100. The strange part is not the price. It is that almost nobody will ever tell you why the gap exists. Not the person at the counter, not the label, not the brand that spent years teaching you what a serious cooler is supposed to cost. I have fished out of a lot of boats, and I have watched a lot of sharp anglers load a small fortune into a box that keeps a bag of ice about a day longer than the one their father used. That day can matter, but it is almost never worth $200. And by the end of this, you will know, down to the ounce of foam, exactly where that $200 went, and how to keep it in your pocket, not with a coupon. With about 90 seconds of understanding that the people selling you the box would rather you never had. 10 coolers, every one of them living in the shadow of the big name. Number 3 on this list held ice for 6 days, and it costs less than a tank of gas for the truck. But before any of that, there is one thing about that expensive box you are picturing. One fact the wall it hangs on was never built to say out loud. Here is a small thing that turns out to be a large thing. You have almost certainly never seen a photograph of the most famous cooler company actually building its own hard coolers. There is a reason for that. Those hard coolers are spun into shape by a contract molder in Oostburg, Wisconsin, called Dutchland Plastics, and they have been doing it since 2013. Dutchland is one of the 5 largest rotational molders in North America. The same kind of line that turns out those premium coolers also turns out kayaks, playground equipment, furniture and coolers for a whole shelf of other names. The founder of that famous brand went on record calling Dutchland among the best molders in the country. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is not a scandal. Nobody did anything shady. Farming out the molding is ordinary smart manufacturing. The point is quieter and more useful than a scandal. The box itself is not a secret. It is a commodity. A skilled molder in Wisconsin can make that box, and does, for more than one label on the wall. So if the box is not the secret, where did your $200 go? To answer that, we have to spend 30 seconds inside the wall of the cooler. And once you see it, you can never unsee it on a price tag again. Picture pouring cake batter into a bowl and slowly turning that bowl in every direction so the batter coats the whole inside in one smooth, seamless layer. Now do that with hot plastic instead of batter, and let it harden. That is rotational molding, rotomolding, and it is why a good cooler is a single, seamless shell, with no weak seams for heat to sneak through. Between the outer shell and the inner wall sits a layer of foam, not the crumbly stuff from a cheap picnic box. A dense, closed-cell polyurethane, the same family of insulation a builder sprays into the walls of a house. 2 to 3 inches of it. That foam is doing most of the real work. How dense is that foam? Think of the difference between a tired old couch cushion you sink straight through and a firm new one that holds its shape. Denser foam traps more tiny pockets of still air, and still air is the thing that actually insulates. The premium boxes run a slightly denser foam than the budget ones. That is a real difference. It is also a small one, nowhere near the size of the price gap. And the ice itself is doing something most people never stop to picture. When a solid turns to liquid, when your ice melts, it quietly swallows an enormous amount of heat in the changeover, without its temperature climbing at all. That is why a cooler with any ice left in it hangs right around freezing. The whole job of the box is simply to slow how fast the outside world can feed heat to that ice. Nothing more mysterious than that. And here is the part the price tag is counting on you not thinking about. 2 coolers can use the same molding process and the same kind of foam. What actually separates them comes down to a short, boring list. How dense that foam is, how well the lid gasket seals, that rubber strip, like the seal around your refrigerator door, and how you pack it. Density, seal, and technique. That is the whole game. None of those 3 things can be patented in a way that locks a competitor out. None of them can be bottled and sold back to you every spring in a fresh package, which is exactly why the industry has so little reason to teach them to you and so much reason to sell you the logo instead. Keep that list in your head. We are going to watch it decide every single cooler on the way down. Number 10. Coleman, around $65, and older than every premium name combined. Coleman was a lantern company that wandered into coolers back in the 1950s. and the design has barely changed in decades. Because for what it works. Here is the honest frame. Coleman's own extreme models advertise 5 days of ice. In real July heat, in the 70s, plan on a day and a half, maybe 2. That is not a knock. For a Saturday on the bank or an overnight catfish run, a $65 box you do not cry over when it gets scratched is exactly the right tool. The only mistake is trusting the number on the lid instead of the thermometer beside it. Buy 2 of these for the price of 1 premium roadie cooler. Keep 1 just for fish, and you are already ahead. Number 9. Igloo. Around $80, and this is the one that should stop you cold. Igloo has been making coolers in Katy, Texas since 1947, and by sheer volume, it is one of the largest cooler makers on the planet, turning out tens of thousands of hard coolers a day. Yet almost nobody says the name Igloo in the same breath as premium. That is not an accident of quality. It is an accident of story. Igloo sold you the cooler and never sold you a lifestyle to go with it. And behind the scenes, that quiet giant has been traded like a used truck, passed from one investment firm to the next for years, and finally bought in 2021 by a Swedish appliance company, Dometic, for $677 million. The largest cooler maker in the country, with its own name changing hands over its head, again and again. Hold that thought, because in a few minutes we are going to see what a story is actually worth, in dollars. Number 8. Lifetime. About $100, out of Clearfield, Utah. Here is the quiet joke in it. Lifetime is a massive rotational molding operation. Folding tables, kayaks, playground sets, and the cooler is almost a side effect of all that molding capacity, which means they can spin a seamless 2 to 3 inch walled cooler and sell it for a third of the premium price because the molding line was already paid for by card tables. Same seamless shell, a fraction of the badge. Number 7. The Cabela's Polar Cap. This one earns its spot on the word of people who actually live out of their coolers. The kind of retention that has hunters leaving it half-loaded in a hot truck for days and still finding ice inside. It costs more than the Walmart boxes, so I will not pretend it is pocket change. But set it against a premium cooler of the same size, and you are paying for performance, not for a name. The trade-off, as always, is weight. A cooler this well-insulated is heavy before you put a single fish in it, which sets up a rule we are going to come back to, hard, at the end. Number 6. The Pelican Elite. Pelican built its name on waterproof cases for cameras and rifles, and that obsession with a seal shows up in the cooler. A thick, deliberate gasket and a latch that genuinely does not want to let go. It is not the cheapest box here. If you have ever seen a sealed hard case tossed into a lake and float back up with the contents bone dry, that is the same company, applying the same stubbornness to a lid. What you are paying for is the seal. And the seal, remember, is a full third of the whole equation. Number 5. Canyon. If you fish or camp where the bears do, the Rockies, parts of the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, this matters in a way that ice days do not. Independent gear testers have ranked Canyon at the top for value, holding sub-40-degree temperatures for more than 5 days. And like several boxes on this list, certain models carry a bear-resistant certification from the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. That certification is a real, testable standard, not a sticker somebody printed. And if you are in bear country, check your local regulations, because in some areas, a certified container is not a nicety, it is the law. That is exactly the kind of detail the price tag never mentions, and the Ranger absolutely will. Everything I have laid out so far, the short list of what actually decides ice retention, the honest ratings set against the marketing ratings, and the sources, so you can check every number for yourself, I have gathered onto a single page. One page you can tape inside your cooler lid, or laminate and keep in the boat. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the next cooler is the one a famous brand took all the way to federal court, and the story you have probably heard about how that ended is backwards. Number 4. RTIC. Around $120, and the most interesting legal story on this list. So let us tell it straight, because the popular version has it upside down. RTIC was started in Texas by twin brothers, John and Jim Jacobson, and it shipped its first cooler in 2015, A box so close to the famous one that with the labels peeled off, you would struggle to tell them apart. The famous brand sued in federal court in Texas. And here is the part people get backwards. It did not end with the little guy standing firm and walking away clean. In the settlement, finalized in early 2017, RTIC agreed to pay the larger company to stop selling the products named in the suit and to redesign them. So the RTIC you can buy today is the redesigned one. And by independent testing, it rides right on the bumper of the premium cooler for ice retention, at a fraction of the price. One gear outlet ran a 45-quart head-to-head and found the two of them neck and neck for days. The lesson is not that somebody got away with something. It is that once you strip the story off the box, the physics underneath was never anyone's private property. Which is exactly what number 3 is about to prove, with a number sitting right there in the title. Number 3. The Ozark Trail, Walmart's own rotomolded cooler, for around $100 or under. This is the 6-day box from the title, so let me be exact about that number, because being exact is the entire point of this channel. The manufacturer's published rating on the mid-size model runs up to about 7 days in ideal conditions. Independent testing, from reviewers who do this for a living, puts it at roughly 5 to 7 days in controlled tests, landing only a day or two behind the premium cooler in identical conditions. 6 days sits right in that band, when you do it right. Block ice, a pre-chilled box, kept in the shade, lid mostly shut. Leave it cracked open in direct 90-degree sun, and you will get closer to 4. And that honest 4-day floor is not the scandal. The value is the scandal. 6 days of ice, for under $100, from a box that is rotomolded, 2.5 to 3 inches thick, and on several models wears the same bear-resistant certification the expensive coolers brag about. Here is how you actually get the 6. Freeze a jug or a block of ice solid, set it on the bottom, cubed ice on top, and do not crack the lid to keep checking on it. The famous cooler beats this one by a day, maybe 2. It also costs 3 to 4 times as much. That gap, call it $250, is a guided inshore charter, or a season of fishing licenses, or a small stack of good hard baits. The ice does not know what the box cost. Neither does the fish. So does this box humiliate the famous one? Not on a stopwatch. The expensive cooler will outlast it by a day. It humiliates it on the receipt. Same seamless shell, the same thick foam, the same bear certification, 6 days of ice, and a couple $100 still sitting in your wallet at the end of it. That is the only scoreboard that shows up on your next trip to the water. Number 2. The Coho, the rotomolded cooler that surfaces at Costco, usually somewhere between $130 and $200, and then disappears the moment the season turns. Here is the buried mechanic. A warehouse club like that is known for capping how much it will mark up any product. A low, fixed ceiling. Set that against a premium cooler brand whose gross margin runs around 57%, and the Coho makes instant sense. It is not a cheap cooler. It is a genuinely good cooler, sold close to cost, because the store makes its money on your membership, not on the box. That 57%, set against a warehouse markup you could count on one hand, that gap, right there, is the dollar value of the story. It is what you have been paying for all along. The catch is simple, and it is maddening. It is seasonal. When you see it on the floor, that is the trip to buy it. Miss the window, and you are waiting until next year. Number 1. And this is the one that turns the whole list inside out. There is an entire class of rotomolded coolers. The one I will point at is sold under the name X-Spec, but there are a dozen like it, that carry no story at all. No lifestyle, no country song on the radio, no logo anyone recognizes on a dock. And independent gear labs have quietly found these no-name boxes hanging right in, with the premium coolers on insulation. That is the whole secret of this list, standing in plain sight. A cooler you have never heard of can match a $350 icon, because the box was never the thing you were buying. Remember the short list from the start? Foam density, gasket seal, and technique. 2 of those 3 are baked into any decent rotomolded box, no matter whose name is on the side. And the third one, technique, is not for sale at any price. It is yours, for free, the second somebody tells you, which almost nobody does. So let me be the one who does. because knowing which box to buy is only half of beating that price tag. The other half is what you do after you carry it home. This is the part the wall of coolers was never going to tell you, because none of it has a barcode. First, the 2-cooler rule. Keep 1 box for drinks and 1 box for fish, and never let the 2 meet. Every time you open the lid for a cold drink, you dump the cold air and warm your catch. A dedicated fish box that stays shut will outpreserve a $300 cooler that the whole crew is reaching into all day. That second cooler can be a $25 Coleman. It is not about the box. It is about the lid staying closed. Second, and this one cuts against the common advice, think hard before you pull the plug and drain the meltwater. The usual tip is to let the water run out so it is not sitting around your catch. But cold water, kept genuinely cold, carries cold better than air does. A slush of ice and cold water wrapped around a fish chills it faster and holds it more evenly than ice alone with air gaps between the cubes. The rule that keeps it safe is simple. Keep that slush cold, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the moment the water starts feeling like anything warmer than ice, drain it and refresh it. Cold slush is your friend. Warm water is your enemy. Learning the line between them is the whole discipline. Third, a block beats cubes. A solid block of ice has far less surface area than the same weight of cubes, so it melts far slower. Block on the bottom for staying power. A handful of cubes on top for fast contact. Fourth, pre-chill. Loading ice into a warm box means the first hours of that ice are spent cooling the plastic instead of your fish. Sacrifice a cheap bag the night before, dump it in the morning, then load for real. Anglers who live out of their coolers will tell you it buys a full extra day. Fifth, keep it full and keep it shaded. Empty space in a cooler is just room for warm air to sit, so fill the gaps with more ice or even a rolled towel, and aim for roughly 2 parts ice to 1 part food and drink on a long day. In hard sun, draping a light-colored towel or a reflective wrap over the lid cuts the heat the box has to fight all day, and it costs you nothing you do not already own. And one warning if you buy secondhand: the gasket is the first thing on any cooler to die. A used premium box with a cracked, hardened seal will lose to a brand new $80 cooler every time, because a broken seal beats good foam. Run a finger all the way around that rubber before you hand over $1. A fresh gasket runs about $10. A bad one quietly bleeds ice all season and never tells you why. And if you are keeping fish, remember the 2 things no box can help you with. Check your state and local regulations on your limits and on moving anything between waters. A cooler is not a license, and it is never a reason to carry live bait or live fish from one lake to the next. That is how invasive trouble spreads, and in most places it is against the law. Go back to those 2 coolers from the opening, the $350 box, and the plain one sitting beside it. Nothing about them has changed in the last 20 minutes. Same seamless shells, same family of foam. The famous one is still, genuinely, a very good cooler. What changed is that you can now see the $200 for what it is. It is not ice. It is the story printed on the box, and the box, we know now, gets spun on the same kind of Wisconsin molding line as half its rivals. The performance was never locked in a vault. It just never got printed on the label, because a label has no reason to hand you the one short list that lets you spend 1/3 as much. Density, seal, and the technique you are now carrying in your head. You do not have to buy the cheap cooler. Plenty of people love their expensive one, and it earns its keep on the water. But you will never again stand in that aisle and mistake a price tag for physics. If you would rather fish knowing what the wall will not say out loud, you already know which side of this you are on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one quiet, unpatentable, unsellable piece at a time.